like I'm talking to a 5-year-old.
This is the One Accord Podcast, and we're back again with another episode in our Biblical Theology project, this time tackling Leviticus chapters 11 through 15. And I'm excited to dig into this material, as always, with our normal team. So once again, we've got Eric and Greg and Micah. Micah, let's start with you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Just recovering on this sunny Monday from a good Lord's Day yesterday. So doing well, though.
Recovering's not usually a word that I hear. Was it a particularly taxing Lord's Day?
Too much communion wine for Micah.
That's not what he means.
Not particularly taxing. Just there's tired, and then there's preaching tired.
Yeah,
and it's that kind of tired this morning.
Yeah, no, I think that maybe people who've never experienced that don't know what you're describing, but I know what you're talking about. The mental fog.
Those that listen to his sermons are also tired.
Gotta clear this fog. That's Greg. That's rude. How are you doing today, Greg?
Looking for a fight. So no, I'm actually kind of tired too. And maybe this is a trend. Just didn't want to get out of bed this morning, but yet here I am. So.
Well, we're glad that you're here. And Eric, how about you? You bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, or are you dragging like everybody else today?
I'm actually dragging. I didn't sleep well last night.
Oh boy!
So I'm among the tired group. But I'm encouraged or excited that we're going through these difficult chapters, because I know a lot of people are like really confused by some of these things. I am confused by some of these things. So I'm looking forward to shining some light on that. Hopefully people will shine light for me too.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I mean, if we're relying on me to keep the energy level up, we might be waiting a long time. So hopefully you guys wake up a little bit. But you seem like you're doing all right. And I know even in our pre-show meeting, there was some extra jabs being thrown. So I don't know, maybe...
and who was throwing those, Joe, just for clarity?
It might have started with me. I can't remember. We'll have to check the record. But anyway, we are digging into Leviticus 11 through 15 today. And Eric is... You just said these are some difficult things. A lot of people have questions about these chapters. I know that even as I've gone through the Bible with people and written about this, these are chapters that often even I don't have much to say about. So I'm very much looking forward to what you guys have to say about these things. And so let's go ahead and dive right in. For those who watch our show on a regular basis, you know that we often will read the chapters, but when we cover a lot of chapters, we tend to not do that. And so today we are not going to be reading the chapters. If you're not familiar with this section of Leviticus, we would encourage you possibly to press pause and familiarize yourself with the content. But we're going to operate as if everybody kind of knows what's going on. And so let's dig into Leviticus chapter 11. What kinds of things, as we read this description here in this chapter, made animals either clean or unclean? And then a follow-up question to that, you can tackle one or both, I suppose, as we discuss. Did these laws serve any kind of practical purpose? Or were there spiritual reasons for these distinctions? Can we discern that at this point, or do we just kind of have to table that for later? What do you guys think about this?
Well, just to give you a brief summary of the chapter, animals with split hooves and that chewed cud were acceptable to eat, according to verse 3. It's not, at least immediately clear to me, why that is. There's, I guess you could theorize some things. I guess if you knew a lot about animals, which I don't, maybe these things would make more sense. But if an animal did not have both these characteristics, it was considered unclean, according to verses 4 through 8. Also, animals that walked on all four paws were unclean. The Israelites could eat any aquatic animals that had fins and scales. And verses 13 through 19 include a list of birds that could not be eaten, birds that were unclean. All winged insects that walk on all fours were detestable to the Israelites. The Israelites were to consider them detestable. The chapter also includes many swarming things that were unclean. It gives a list of those. And animals that died of natural causes could not be eaten. So, like, you could, of course, kill an animal and eat it, but if it died naturally, then it was unclean and it could not be eaten. So this is just a very brief summary of the kinds of animals that could be eaten and the kinds that could not. There's no question, I think, that the dietary laws served practical purposes. For example, as most people know, pigs were unclean; they could not be eaten. And I know that in ancient times, pigs often had worms and things in their intestines. It was just kind of they were an animal that we would kind of think of as naturally being unclean. So I've read a little bit about that. This diet, I think, obviously promoted health and well-being among the Israelites. But I also think that keeping these laws would separate Israel from the surrounding nations and consecrate them to the Lord, and that's what verses 44 and 45 seem to say. So as I look at these laws, I think all of the laws were meant to be a constant reminder of Israel's separation from the world and their devotion to God. We can't, because we're trying not to look ahead, which is very hard to resist sometimes.
Especially for Greg.
Especially for Greg. I want to zero in on him.
You assume I'm trying. It's not hard. I just refuse to play by the rules sometimes.
So as I'm reading this chapter, I am trying to set aside some things that the New Testament says, but just for the sake of the format of the show, I'm going to just leave it at that for now.
Yeah, I think that if there are really like practical health and wellness motives behind these commands, those seem to be minored on in the text rather than majored on. For instance, like not eating anything that died by itself. Okay, like I think that there are pretty clear, like Eric said, I think there are pretty clear health implications for that. You're eating a diseased animal or something like that. So, but those do seem to be in the background to me. They're pushed. They would seem to be in the periphery. I think that the emphasis of the text is really upon ceremonial separateness for the people of God. And then another thing that I was thinking about as well is, these kinds of things some of them might seem superfluous to us. What's the difference between eating a fly and eating a locust or something like that? Or, what's the difference between
big difference.
Taste-wise, morally speaking, or what's the difference between eating chicken and eating some other type of bird? Maybe a lot with regard to how it tastes or how palatable it is, but in terms of God's law, that might seem, isn't that a little bit superfluous? Well, I think that one of the reasons for this is to acknowledge the absolute authority that God has over their lives to govern even things like this. Like he says, he wants their obedience to him to be so extensive that even these things that it might not seem like there's anything wrong with eating a hawk, you're going to obey me in this too. So maybe that would be part of the purpose. But I think that the text majors on this ceremonial separateness, this holiness unto the Lord that made them distinct from the other nations.
Yeah, when I got just let you see behind the curtain a little, we get a show sheet, somebody writes questions, and when I read this question, the question was actually phrased as, did these laws serve merely practical purposes, i.e. making people healthy, or were there spiritual reasons for these distinctions? I'm with you, Micah. I don't want to discount the fact that there were probably very practical reasons, not to eat some of these things. Maybe pigs did have worms then, but don't now. All those arguments may be there. I don't see the point of what God's doing here as about making people more or less healthy, but setting up a distinction among the people. And now, were all these things eaten by the people of the land? They probably were. But yeah, I have no doubt that there's a health benefit to not eating carrion vultures. No doubt. But I don't know that's the point that this text is trying to make.
I have a follow-up question for everybody too. Aside from the obvious, like don't eat a dead animal. That's don't eat a carcass.
Don't eat roadkill.
Yeah, don't eat roadkill. I mean, some of these things go without saying, but do you? And maybe it's too early to ask this, but as you guys were talking, there were some ideas that popped into my mind, and One of them was, sometimes, some pagan nations would hold certain animals in very high regard. The Egyptians had a whole, bunch of animals that they thought were representations of their gods or whatever.
I eat cows just to irritate Indians, right? Like that's it's not true. I love cow.
I love beef is fantastic. Yeah. I don't do it for that reason, but but do you think it's possible that God had in mind, like, okay, so the Egyptians would hold certain animals in very high regard, and so we're gonna actually treat those animals as detestable, as opposed to the Egyptians, elevating them. So do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think it's possible, right? I don't want to say no, it's impossible, but I would like to have seen that clearly spelled out in the text, because otherwise we just start reading in, and we go and find an interesting historical fact, and we say, that's why God was doing this. Well, I'd rather just let the text say, and for whatever, and we've seen this before, right? We go, why did God choose to do this? And we kind of all look at each other and we go, well, because he did. I'm fairly comfortable allowing this section to be kind of like that. Unless I'm reading it wrong, like lobster would be off the plate, no pun intended here. And lobster's delicious, and I don't think it makes me less healthy so far as I know. And so do I want to find some practical reason behind every one of these things? I guess I don't have the need to. If it was about what Egypt was doing, great, yay that. I would just like the text to say it before I hold fast to it.
Well, I want to just clarify. The reason why I said merely practical is because I think the average reader, their first time through the Bible, when they come upon this chapter, even though the very last verses in the chapter, I think, make it fairly clear, why God is saying this, although there is still some ambiguity even there.
And I just see a habit, right? We've all sat in church for many, many years, and if any pastor dares to try to tackle some of this stuff, I think one of the temptations we want to do is explain it and give a reason. And so we do jump to these things. And so my point of pushing back is so that there is a voice pushing back saying those things might be true, but I just want to hold on to what the text says. Focus.
The connection between these unclean foods, though, and the Gentiles is not, in Gentile nations that were not Jewish, is not without warrant, because we see that in Acts when this is reversed, it's the connection between the eating of the unclean.
That's exactly what I'm trying to avoid.
Of course,
Micah.
me too. I was trying to find out
the eating of the unclean animal.
He took the demerit for the team on this case. Yeah.
To the gospel going to the Gentiles. It's tied to that. So I think that I think that you can say, okay, well, there's some reason that these foods were excluded for the distinction of God's people. They could have been religious reasons. They could have just been cultural reasons. But I think that you can say there's some reason for it.
Yeah, my only point wasn't that I want to try to go back and research and say, did Egypt have some affinity to pigs or rabbit? Like that might be true, but I don't need that reason to walk away from the text satisfied with what God has said.
I've heard a number of theories on those things. None of them have ever been satisfying to me, not because, for all the reasons that you're saying. It's like, well, yeah, that could be true, but I guess I just don't know enough about it to know this. One, a really interesting one that I heard that I don't know if you guys have ever heard this, is that some of these unclean animals, they have an association with death. So you mentioned like hawks, these are predator birds, pigs, they'll eat pretty much anything. And so, the idea, you said don't eat something that's roadkill. The cause of death in that case makes sense. There do seem to be some practical things. If an animal in your herd just falls over dead, there's probably something going on with that animal that you probably don't want to eat that one. That does seem to at least have a practical purpose, that, whatever caused it to spontaneously die, maybe you don't want to ingest that and introduce that into your household. But the idea of, the associations with death being the clean and unclean, and then of course that by analogy, of course, to other unclean nations would make sense. The dietary rules of health in particular do become confusing. You open the door for the future conversation from Acts, so obviously you took the demerit for that. Well done. But even looking backwards, stuff that we have talked about, it seems like we've seen this distinction that exists. This is the most clear delineation that we've received anyway. But, when Noah went onto the ark, he took 7 pairs of clean animals because he was going to sacrifice clean animals. And so this distinction between clean and unclean was at least partially known. It must have been known to Noah for him to be able to make those distinctions. It says that God brought these animals. So maybe it was simply like he just looked at the ones that had 7 pairs versus the ones that had 1 pair. But to the best of my recollection, God, after they came off the ark and after the sacrifices were made of the clean animals, God made no distinction about the dietary laws. And similarly, if he then lifts the dietary restrictions later, it seems hard to believe that that's simply for health reasons, because why would God have allowed them to eat something that's bad for them and then given a restriction and then lifted it, for our current new covenant age? The lobster thing, maybe in God's foreknowledge, he knew that maybe the lobster meat isn't bad. It's the gallon of butter you're also going to ingest with it. It's also bad for you. But the health the health matters or those other things seem odd to me. If it seems like the restriction is being put now for a purpose, and yes, there is a desire for pastors and teachers to say, well, here's what the purpose is, and it has to make sense to everybody, both believer and unbeliever alike. But what if the purpose is something like what we talked about last time? It's about the holiness of God. It's about the holiness of these people. It's not about you'll be healthier if you eat these necessarily. It's just that you'll be holier if you refrain from eating these things, because now you'll be distinct and nobody else has these same types of laws, but I'm giving them to you so that you will be distinct as my people, in addition to your clothing, in addition to your practice, in addition to all these other things. And that's always been enough for me that I just personally haven't sought for something else. But what do you guys think about that other issue? Again, looking back so that there's no demerit, this distinction between clean and unclean. For us, we're reading it most clearly now, but did Noah know this? Did other people know this? And then was the distinction on the dietary laws formalized and we just didn't read about it until now? Or do you guys read that previous passage the same, that up until this point, they were allowed to eat all that other stuff, and now they're being restricted on the dietary laws, about a distinction that they might have already known, but now is being just clearly laid out?
I have a theory, and it's not anything that I've studied exhaustively. So if it's lame, then it is. But I've wondered. I guess it's not really a theory; it's just something I've wondered. Moses wrote the first 5 books. We know that. I wonder if Noah even realized, like, these are clean animals. Or if Moses, while writing it, just observed, okay, these are clean animals. It would be quite a coincidence that he accidentally offered only clean animals, unless God simply told him, okay, I want you to offer these animals and no others. But I wonder if Noah didn't realize that. But then when Moses was writing the Torah, he just made the observation, these are clean animals that Noah offered.
You're offering a solution similar to why the name Yahweh appears before it's made known.
Yeah, that's the same argument.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, I'm not getting into that, but I'm just all I'm saying is that
because Moses knew it as the author of it, he's writing those things back into it.
I'm just saying that could be a possibility. I don't know if Noah actually realized, okay, these are clean, or if God just said, Noah, you don't need to know why right now, but I just want you to know you need to offer these animals and not other ones.
That's an interesting point.
I think that there's a possibility that they knew far more than we give them credit for, and that they had far more revelation from God than we have recorded for us in the first 5 books. I mean, because once again, these books are written by Moses, and the details that God chooses to inspire in these accounts of previous events are there for a reason, but they're select. So I think that there was probably far more direct revelation from God about things to do and things not to do in that era than we can imagine now. And I think there are hints of that. One of the hints, I think, is the clean versus unclean animals. I see that in those earlier periods as distinctly tied to sacrifice, those things that prefigured the coming of the serpent crushing seed of the woman. I mean, immediately after they're expelled from the garden, we see Cain and Abel offering sacrifices. Where does that come from? Well, I think there's probably some form of revelation in there, and that's a little bit speculative, but I don't think it's too far of a leap. But I think that the clean and unclean are distinctly tied to sacrifice rather than necessarily diet under those circumstances. So I think that God at least gave people bare bones instructions about this is how you're going to approach me. It's going to be through sacrifice, and even perhaps some animals that were good to sacrifice. Some people tie the animal skins that were wrapped around Adam and Eve to the institution of those sacrifices. Some people would prefer not to go that route with that text, but there is an interesting phrase when it's talking about the after Cain and Abel, the line of Cain gets introduced, and then the line of Seth. Adam knew his wife again. She bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. And at that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's really interesting, because were people not religious before this? Were people not spiritually inclined before this? I don't think you can say that. I think that probably points to some form of instituted worship in the line of promise. So once again, I think that indicates that maybe they had more revelation from God than we think that they did when we just read these accounts.
I think it's one thing that you said that I thought, when you said that the clean animals, there was a distinction between clean and unclean, but the clean, it was specifically for sacrifice. Now that could make sense, because it's clearly, like Joe said, that in Genesis, 9, where God said, you can eat anything. Like he didn't seem to make a distinction at that time. So I think that, but then there was something else you said. I was half listening, so but no, but what you said was good. But remember in Genesis 3, when God cursed the serpent, and he said, "You're gonna, lick the dust of the." It's like implying that crawling on your belly is like a kind of like a curse. It's like it's not an ideal way to move about. And then in Leviticus 11, verse 43 or verse 42. Whatever crawls on its belly, and whatever walks on all fours, whatever has many feet, in respect to every swarming thing that swarms on the earth, you shall not eat them, for they are detestable. And this makes me think that maybe there's some connection between, I don't know, the way that these animals are, and that these things are pointing to some kind of spiritual truth. I'm not going to be the guy that gives 1,000 theories about what each thing represents, because I have no idea. But I look at this and I think, this, maybe there's something to this, that there's more meaning in this than just God arbitrarily, picking one animal over the other to be clean or unclean.
Let's go ahead and move forward into chapter 12 to another issue that receives a lot of speculation and sometimes some hostility. Certainly some things that I've heard, obviously just like you guys have heard so many objections to Scripture, and sometimes called a misogynistic book or something like that. Perhaps some things from Leviticus 12 come into that. And so our first question is in chapter 12, why was a mother unclean for 7 days after giving birth to a male child, a boy, but then unclean for 2 weeks after giving birth to a girl? We read that in the first 5 verses of Leviticus 12.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The amount of time was only 7 days for a male child.
As I read it, it's 33 plus 7, right? Am I reading it wrong?
No, I think it goes.
Then she shall
on.
remain in the blood of her impurity. If I could read, man, which I can't. Then she will remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days, and she shall not touch any consecrated thing or another sanctuary. So 7 days, and then a clock started on 33, and for a girl it was 14 days, and then a clock started on 66 more.
The point is still the same, right? Yeah. Because the point is she's more unclean. She's unclean longer for a girl than she is for a boy. So yeah, I think you're right about that. I guess the question is, well, obviously, why is that? I don't believe this is because females are inherently worse than males. I'm guessing here, and I'm gonna make it clear that this is only a guess. I don't have any proof of this, but it could be that because Eve was the first to sin, it might be that all the daughters of Eve, in a sense, bear her reproach. There is a little bit about this, not this specific thing, but there's a little bit about this concept in the New Testament. We don't have, we're not going to go there, but I think there does seem like, in Scripture, even someone didn't sin directly, like what their ancestors did can affect their reputation. So I don't know. This is just a guess. I can't prove this. I don't know if there's some biological reason for this or what. If there is, I don't know anything about it. But that's my best guess based on very little information.
Greg, I'm looking at your face while you're hearing this. You don't seem like you're on board with at least some of those answers.
Yeah. Again, I know that I have a higher tolerance for mystery than most people. Like I don't have to have every answer. I don't have to have an answer for every question. Not every mystery needs to be solved for me. And so I can comfortably say, I don't know why God chose to do this. Whether I'm looking forward in the text or looking backward in the text, I don't see a clear causal, this is why God chose to do it this way. All I really see is this is the way that God established it. Why does the world work the way it does? Because that's the way God ordered it. That's why. And I'm just very comfortable with that. And so, like, maybe Eric's right. I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying, like, I don't see that. And I don't need to dig for it until I can find that one little nugget that explains everything. So,
yeah, I think that there could be some merit to what Eric was saying. I don't know that we can give a dogmatic answer about it, but if what Eric said about chapter 11, verse 42 is actually a reference back to the curse of the serpent, where whatever goes on its belly, whatever goes on all fours, and has many feet, any swarming thing that swarms on the ground, you shall not eat, for they are detestable. If that actually is a reference back to the curse on the serpent, and it's the association with sin being brought into the world and the curse of sin and death, then it would make sense that what is said here about the uncleanness of childbirth when a female child is coming into the world, it would make sense if that bore some sort of a backward-facing reference as well to the woman being deceived and being the means by which her husband was brought into sin, and sin comes into the world. But like I also sympathize with what Greg was saying. I don't think that you can give a dogmatic answer about it. I think you can point to other scriptures. If people want to come and say, oh, well, this proves that the Bible has a misogynistic bent to it or something like that. Well, you can go to other scriptures and just, show them that's silly. You don't need to interpret this that way. There's nothing necessary about that sort of interpretation here. But it's at least a possibility that this is a backward-facing reference.
Not everything is perfectly equitable in the Bible, right? Like, why did boys have to be circumcised and girls didn't? Were they not part of the covenant? Well, of course they were part of the covenant. So our need to equate everything and make everything balance out perfectly. Otherwise, if it doesn't balance out perfectly, it's misogynistic or it's whatever. Like, I don't have a desire to play that game. And so I don't.
Yeah, no, there is a distinction that is made, and I think that that's one thing that is directly applicable to them in their culture, and it's very relevant today. That from birth, these biological characters, there's a difference, but difference doesn't imply that one is inferior and one is superior. And it is one of the greatest tragedies of really any culture that tries to make everything exactly the same. Like what kind of that flattening out of the distinctions between people is outrageous.
Yeah, and our response, and our necessary response to the difference, like what we see here in chapter 12, I don't see as pointing to the reason for the difference. Like, they aren't, as I understand it, a woman isn't impure longer for a girl child than for a boy child because it's a girl child. This is a result of it being, you are responding to, not pointing. The fact that it's a girl isn't. There's a logic that says that that there's something about being a girl that makes it impure longer, rather than because it's a girl, you're impure longer. Does that make sense? Or
You're
am I
saying
doing a horrible?
the girlness is not causal.
Yes, that's probably better, but maybe not. I don't know. Please
and
cut
I
this.
just want to too, and I don't want to go on and on about this. I'm not going to, but again, as I said before, I am certainly not being dogmatic about these types of things. All I'm doing is I recognize that I don't think anything that God said is arbitrary. Everything He said it for a reason. Now, we don't always know the reason. Actually, as you read through the law, there's many times when, at least for me, I don't know exactly why God said what He said. And so sometimes we have to do what Greg says. It's just, God said it, therefore that's the way it is. I can't help but be, inquisitive about these things and try and, make a connection. I don't want to make it some ridiculous connection or just invent things out of thin air, but I'm inquisitive about this stuff, and that's why I offer at least a possible explanation.
Yeah, and don't hear me say I don't want to talk about it. I'm just saying, like, as we're posing these questions, why? Well,
Greg just doesn't need to plant a flag.
I don't need to plant a flag here.
Yeah. Well, let's ask another question. In the next couple of verses, we read about atonement that needed to be made. Why did atonement need to be made after a mother gave birth?
Well, doesn't say. Now, I have read several commentaries to try and come up with an answer for this. Matter of fact, I studied this a few years ago, and I was kind of discouraged about how many different answers there were. I found there's three common ones, and the first one, which makes perfect sense to me, that the first one seems more realistic than the other two. But the mother was ceremonially unclean, and so atonement had to be made for her uncleanness. The second explanation, she sinned while in labor. That is I think a Jewish interpretation, because the mother is in so much pain and it's such a miserable situation. She may have sinned while giving birth to the child. That's another theory. The third one, she gave birth to a child with a sinful nature, and because she's bringing this sinful child into the world, atonement has to be made for that purpose. So again, I think the first one's the most likely, but if you read commentaries on this, you'll see at least these three come up.
Yeah, I think that there could also be exploring that ceremonial aspect of this a little bit more. Verse 4 says that she shall continue 43 days in the blood of her purifying. And if you go on to verse 5, she shall continue in the blood of her purifying 66 days. I think that there's a reference to the place and the value placed on blood within the whole of the Levitical system. Obviously, women lose blood when they go through childbirth. Some of the things that I read suggested that this could be about her loss of blood, indicating some kind of ceremonial unwholeness because of the premium that's placed on blood in the Levitical system. Once again, that's wildly speculative. But there does seem to be an emphasis upon her loss of blood throughout this whole thing. So it might have something to do with that. And then the sin offering, that's offered here is a way of ceremonially rectifying whatever that was symbolizing.
Yeah, I think I'm probably going to fall somewhat in line with Micah. It seems to me that she is making atonement, and I'm pulling this from verse 7, make atonement, and she shall be cleansed from the flood, or from the flow of her blood. It seems to me that blood plays such an important significance in the ceremony, in the ceremonial law, and all that's going on there, that the flowing of blood, unless it was being let out by a priest in the proper way at the proper time, that it created uncleanness, and that uncleanness had to be atoned for And so whether that happened through normal biological processes, or whether that happened some other way, it had to be cleansed before you could participate in tabernacle worship. And so that's where I see it landing, why it's there.
I appreciate your thoughts on these things, and again, I know that a lot of people discuss them, so thanks for your conversation. Let's move into chapter 13, and it's interesting when you talk to some people, especially who are going through the book of Leviticus for the first time, they're surprised to see that sometimes these priestly duties, they read often like a butcher or like a dermatologist, and so now here we've got all these, this leprosy discussion. Earlier on, we talked about leprosy. We saw that God had made Moses' hand leprous and then healed it instantly. Why do you think that God didn't just miraculously heal everybody who had this? Like, why demonstrate his power over leprosy, and then now we have all this discussion about leprosy without, I guess, the miraculous healing in this case?
In Exodus 15:26, God made the following promise. He said, if you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, he says, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians, for I, the Lord, am your healer. So God did promise to prevent Israel from getting certain diseases that he put on the Egyptians. That is, if they obeyed his commandments. So God is certainly capable of preventing disease and also healing anyone of anything. However, sometimes, and this is not always the case, but sometimes disease could have been the result of sin. I think that's implied in Exodus 15:26. The Egyptians were pagans; they were worshiping false gods. They did evil things, and God. It sounds like God put these diseases on the Egyptians, perhaps for that reason. So. But I want to emphasize that is not always the case. Just because someone has a disease doesn't mean they've, done anything wrong. I mean, some people are born with diseases. So my answer is, we don't always know. We don't know unless God tells us. We don't know why, God lets someone have a disease, and but sometimes He heals somebody else. It's not really clear why. To me, why this is happening, although I think in some cases, if sin could potentially be the cause, but I wouldn't apply that to every case.
I think we need to recognize that ordinary providence does not follow always the same pattern as sign miracles do. Obviously, God was doing a sign through Moses with that, and it was intended to validate Moses' prophetic ministry as a kind of redeemer and a leader of the people of Israel out of Egypt. I don't think that we can expect that ordinary providence will normally follow the same kind of pattern. And we see this with regard to people's treatment of apostolic miracles and stuff too. Everyone wants to ask, well, these gifts of healing were operative, then why in the world don't we see this kind of stuff happening today? Well, set aside the discussion between cessationism and continuationism for a second. I think that reasonable people on both sides of that divide would say that there is something distinct and unique about the apostolic era. There are miracles going on for a particular purpose and a particular reason to validate the gospel that they were preaching and to lay the foundation of the church. I don't think that it's reasonable to expect that God is going to continue in ordinary providence operating in the exact same way at all times, because those signs, those miracles, those healings had a particular purpose that validated a person's prophetic ministry or apostolic ministry. So I think we need to get categories straight in our minds. Why doesn't God heal everyone in the same way that He healed Moses? Well, because that was exceptional. That was for an exception. That was an exceptional circumstance for an exceptional purpose. And to be clear, I'm not saying that God doesn't heal people in that way today. I'm not saying He doesn't. I'm just saying that there's a distinction to be made there.
Apostolic. I didn't see that in Leviticus anywhere.
Eric wants to make sure that Micah gets his full demerit for his running.
I vote Micah gets no demerits.
Thank you,
That's
Greg.
what you did last time too.
I knew I
Greg's,
could count on you.
Greg's very lenient. I mean, I guess I can start giving Micah's demerits to Greg if he wants. Someone's getting it.
Greg will bear the reproach.
I will bear the sins of my buddy.
Greg, you were about to say something.
Yeah. So I'm probably going to say something quite a bit similar to Micah, only I'm going to say it like I'm talking to a 5-year-old because I am mentally more like a 5-year-old. What is a miracle, right? Norman Geisler defines a miracle as a supernatural singularity, a thing that happens once, super outside of nature. It's divine intervention into the natural world. God breaks out of natural and heals Moses. And we go, well, why doesn't God always do that? Well, if God always did it, it would be nature. It'd be natural, it'd be the way of the world. And so, yeah, I don't see why we would have to say that if God does a supernatural singularity, therefore it must always and forever be not a singularity, but the way of the world. And I think that's very similar to what Mike was saying. Again, just putting the cookies on a little bit lower shelf. I don't expect God to be miraculous in the same way at every time because he's miraculous once. It's enough for me that he raised the sun once. He doesn't have to raise the sun over and over and over again from the dead. He created the universe once. He doesn't have to. It doesn't have to be repeatable for it to be glorious. It was done once.
Well, I think that's well said, and I'll go on the record, Greg. I love it when you talk to me like I'm 5, so I really appreciate that.
Micah uses lots of big words, and I understood maybe 2 of them, and so I think maybe I was saying something along the same lines.
Let's ask our next question in the same chapter. Again, as someone's reading through this, they just might wonder, like, what in the world? Why is there so much importance put onto this? Many people who are watching this or listening to this might not even know what leprosy is, and there's so much discussion about it. Why was it so important to identify this among this people at this time?
Well, I want to first point out that the Hebrew word sarath, I think is how it's pronounced, that's translated leprosy. It doesn't necessarily refer to leprosy. This is clear, I think, from the fact that it could be found on a garment or on the walls of a house. We read about that in chapter 14. Whatever it was that was found on humans, it was an infection that could spread to others and cause them to defile the tabernacle, resulting in death. And we read about that even later on in chapter 15, verse 31. God was concerned about, the tabernacle being defiled and, holiness compromised. So I think it made them ceremonially unclean and unfit to approach God or the tabernacle. I think that was the main concern. But again, obviously you don't want disease to spread throughout a community either. So that's part of it.
Especially a disease that makes you unclean, right? Like if me brushing up against you makes you unfit to go and stand before God and worship him, that's a serious thing, right?
Yeah, I was going to echo exactly what Eric said. This referred to a number of diseases that can manifest themselves in the skin, and the fact that it's called leprosy is in our English translations is a little bit unfortunate. I don't know a better word, but I think that it really had to be dealt with severity and with quickness, because not only would there be disastrous effects for everybody in the camp. Just think about the way that diseases function. You could have the incubation period where you're contagious and you're not even having any symptoms. Like, how many people could you have already infected? And obviously this is not part of the text, but God knows these things. How many people could you have already infected before you ever start manifesting symptoms in your skin? So as soon as you start manifesting these symptoms, it's as if get the priest here now and figure out what to do, because it's like this thing could spread like gangrene through the camp.
Well, that does lead into this next kind of prescription. there's some instruction in verses 45 and 46, for example, that people are put out. Is that simply for these practical reasons, or is there some spiritual reason? I think in some of our previous conversation, Micah, you brought up this kind of overarching testimony of exclusion from the camp for spiritual reasons, and certainly according to sin. So again, similar to our questions before, is this practical, spiritual, both? Do we know why do we have instructions like 45 and 46 in chapter 13?
Well, again, there are obvious practical reasons for these instructions. They were intended to prevent the spread of infection, like we already talked about. But because the word unclean seems to have a double meaning in Scripture, unclean doesn't just mean, I have a disease that can spread to somebody else. But I think unclean also bears with it the idea that, it's kind of like a visible representation of sin and its harmful effects on oneself and on others. I think it looks like it was a picture of sin and the destruction that it causes. We saw something similar with like leaven. Get all the leaven out, every little bit of it. And so I think there's some representations here. For the practical reasons are just as obvious as they could be, but I think that to limit it only to practical and not take it any further is a mistake.
There's also some language here in these verses that is interesting. It describes other situations too. Person who has the disease wearing torn clothes, the hair of their head hanging loose, covering his upper lip or covering his mouth, crying out, "Unclean, unclean." Those were other actions that were associated with mourning. So there's a grieving aspect to this, where your disease bears this relationship to the curse of sin and death, in a similar way that you'd mourn someone who dies, or you mourn something else, and you would do these things. I think we need to sort of underline the fact that these are actions of grief. It's a horrendous thing to be separated from the camp of those who belong to the Lord.
There is a general biblical principle for which I will give no direct quotes, that implies that those that you are close to and those that you spend your time in close fellowship with have an effect upon you and upon your walk. And so as I read this, and I try to put a modern day application. I said before, Christians don't fall into sin; they slide into sin. I don't wake up in the morning. What I'm gonna do? I'm gonna go cheat on my wife, like out of nowhere, out of context. No, there's been a slide there. So when I see this, and I think, what if I was commanded by God when I was walking in a prideful way? It's hardness of heart. If I was obligated by God to holler out, prideful, or jealous, or whatever this is, you guys would know about that. It'd be really obvious what I was struggling with. And it would be a clear warning sign to you, like, hey, listen, maybe you need to keep some distance from Greg right now, or rebuke him. I mean, he's confessing to the sin, so it's not like he's not being somewhat repentant. But this has a spiritual value that if we were to practice it today, if you knew what I was struggling with, there'd be no way that I could lure you into whatever sin that I'm walking in. And so, as a modern application, I think this would be it's at least interesting to consider how the uncleanness here equates the uncleanness in our modern Christian life, and how our willingness to confess that and allow others to know of it could increase the health of the body overall.
That certainly is an interesting parallel, and I think I'm with you as far as it goes. On the surface, reading this passage, I don't know if you were doing what you were describing, if you're wrestling with pride, for example, and you're shouting out prideful, so that we have to stay away from you. I don't feel as bad for you, because I want you to repent and just, knock it off. I feel bad for these lepers, they have to be isolated and separated out. And if
'Cause it
anybody
probably isn't their fault, right?
Sure. Well, maybe. I mean, Eric
Yeah.
mentioned the possibility that this is a result of sin, so that's possible. But it is also possible that I mean, people get various skin diseases or whatever, just as part of living in a broken world. And if to have to shout these things, I mean, literally, almost if you see anybody who could possibly make human contact, you need to alert them so they don't get anywhere closer. This is a very isolating time. And I do think that for those who skip these chapters or whatever, we do want to keep this in mind for later. And I certainly will kind of go back to some of these concepts much later, in our project when we are getting to later things. But I'll resist myself from running ahead. I just want to mark that this is this isolation. It would have been a huge deal, but it wasn't always permanent, which is a good thing. And so in the next chapter, we see that there is a way that lepers at least have a hope of being declared clean. We read in chapter 14, verse 20, again, atonement needed to be made. And so a declaration before they could pass out of this unclean state to this clean state. Obviously, their condition would have had to clear it up. But then even so, there's a sacrifice that needs to be made. Any insight on this? I mean, or is it basically everything that we've already discussed before? You have anything to add about the need for atonement to be made for a leper to pass from unclean to clean?
Well, after atonement was made, the man was cleansed of his uncleanness and was welcomed back into fellowship with the covenant community. And remember, though, that atonement was sometimes made for things that were not inherently sinful. Like, atonement was made for the altar back in Exodus 29:37, just to give one example. But again, to me, as I read this, the fact that atonement had to be made for a disease tells me that this is pointing to something more than just, something on the skin. This is pointing to this is pointing to sin, our sinful condition. But there's a ceremonial aspect to it. The guy has to be cleansed, and he has to be fit to approach God, and as Greg said, to go back to tabernacle worship, and just to go back to the community itself, which I'm sure he was grieved that he had to be separated from it. So again, there's this picture of separation, but then reconciliation, being brought back into the covenant community, and in a sense being brought back to God, and being able to fellowship and worship Him at the tabernacle.
Yeah, I think that there's a sense in which, atonement is made for something that's not necessarily sinful here, but it is part of the whole complex of the curse of sin and death. Certainly horrible diseases like this that cause you to be permanently put outside the camp. That is a result of sin. That's a result of the curse of sin and death coming on creation through our first parents plunging us headlong into sin. And it also points forward to the need for an atonement that will deal comprehensively with sin and all of its effects. So not just guilt. Sin. We need an atonement that doesn't just deal with guilt. We need an atonement that's powerful enough to recreate the world. To create a new world where none of the curse of sin and death remains anymore. I think that it's helpful for us to see the connection between atonement and disease, suffering, things like that here.
Yeah, I think more than sin, I just see a disconnected and unfitness to be in the presence of God. So Eric, I think I hear you wanting to point this leprosy back to a sin or maybe just sin in general in a person's life. And maybe that's what's being said without being said. But there is a state of uncleanness that comes with the skin disease. I don't think, because what have we talked about? We're about to talk about the cleansing of the house. Did the house sin? Well, probably not. But there is something that's it's not fit in the sight of God, and so that has to be dealt with. That has to be atoned for, whether it's a direct result of sin or a general result of the sinful state of the creation groaning. Not that I'm referring to any particular Bible verse there, but
I like that you keep giving that qualification to try and, for a guy who says he doesn't care about demerits, you do try and make sure that you don't accumulate them all the time.
fine.
But Eric, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts. Again, Greg is mentioning our next question on the sheet, which, in the same chapter 14, verse 34, God specifically says that he might put a mark of leprosy on a house and then what they're supposed to do. But, it's been mentioned that leprosy can be on persons, of course. It can be in houses. It can be on garments. And so, why would God put a mark of leprosy on a house? And then again, I don't know if you had any other thoughts about, Greg was kind of responding to you. So any other thoughts on our next question or what Greg was saying?
Well, just briefly about what Greg said, I want to make it clear that I am not saying that everyone that has a disease has it because they sinned. I said earlier that...
I think you made that clear before, too.
Yeah. In some cases, disease can be the result of sin, but it's most certainly is not always. And I think, if the disease by itself is the issue, then we have to wonder, well, why does God not like diseased people? I mean, the disease is pointing to something. It's not just that the person's ill. It's obviously more than that, and at least in my opinion. So that's my 2 cents on that. But why would God put a mark of leprosy on a house? Well, again, there's not universal agreement on this. I actually think I have a reasonable answer, but some have thought that this is describing a judgment from God. Like God put the mark there because the guy did something wrong, and God's punishing him by putting this mark of, not leprosy, but whatever it was, mold or something that's going to ruin his house. But if you read the context, I highly doubt this is talking about a judgment from God, because the mark may or may not have been malignant, it says. And the house did not necessarily need to be torn down. In some cases, it could simply be replastered, and the guy could keep the house. So that God put the mark on the house could simply mean, I think this is kind of like going back to, God's sovereignty and God's, my brain's shutting off now. But God's providence. Even if God is not the direct cause of something, sometimes the Bible will say it was still God, that did it. So God can use secondary causes. God can be the direct cause of something. God can simply, permit something to happen. We read back in Exodus where it says, if a guy drops a stone or something as he's building a house, and that stone hits a guy in the head below and kills him, and it says, if God allowed that. So it sounds like God, there are things that, that God gets the credit for, in a sense, without being the direct cause of it. Like God wasn't wasn't actively doing whatever it was. So I think this could just simply be, it could simply be a way of saying that, God is sovereign over all and sovereign over everything, and that's why the mark is on the house. So that satisfies me. It may not satisfy everybody, but that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. That's basically how I took it. God's sovereign superintending of all things.
Fair enough.
Okay. It looks like you're repressing yourself, but you again.
Oh, no, I want to go back to some but let's move on for the sake of time.
All right. Well, last chapter for us to discuss. Let's jump kind of near the end of the chapter. I just want to read verse 31 and get your thoughts on this. Now it says, "Thus you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them." What are the implications of this statement? Any thoughts you have about this particular verse in chapter 15?
Well, the Israelites could not approach the Lord in an unclean state. They could only enter His presence if they were holy and pure. The laws regarding ceremonial cleanness and purity pointed, I think, to the need for a clean and pure heart before God. And this applies to us today. We need to have a clean and pure heart before God. We need to, like Greg's talking about pride before. We need to cast away our pride. We need to cast away, jealousy and anger and all the other things that make us spiritually unclean. And we need to examine our hearts to see if there's anything that is polluting us. And if we see anything there, we need to repent. I think there's a very practical application for us today, even though I realize that, this isn't speaking directly to that. I just can't help but see that in the text.
There's an interesting book. It's a biblical theology of the book of Leviticus, and it's called "Who Shall Ascend the Mountain of the Lord?" Because that's really what this is talking about, as Eric said, who can come into the presence of God. And obviously that is from a later psalm, that phrase itself. But I think that it shows us our inability to come into the presence of God, and our need for one to go into the presence of God for us. I think that's where I don't just think that's where the entire biblical narrative is driving. But as I was reading this, I was somewhat overwhelmed with the sense that who could be clean enough, because there, like Eric was saying, there's a symbolic value to all of these various uncleannesses. The symbolic value is that it points to just how truly defiled we are, by our sins, and how comprehensive that reality of sin is in us. It's not even just that we need to be made clean in order for us to come into the presence of God. There's also a sense in which this is, no, I actually need somebody to go into the presence of God for me. I need a mediator between God and men. That's where my mind went. Obviously that's projecting forward a little bit, but I was impressed with that as I was reading this text.
Yeah, I think the implications, at least for us today, of this is the same God, right? The same God that we see here, giving all of these rules and regulations and all of this about uncleanness. We aren't dealing with a different God today. And so he takes this just as seriously now. Maybe this earns me demerits. Here's where I'll go ahead and take mine. Christ fulfills that. So we have his righteousness. And now we need to live in proper response to being clothed in that righteousness. But thank God he has provided a way, because you guys would surely not be able to maintain this level of righteousness outside of Christ. And so being ejected from God's presence until you clean yourself, until nightfall, whatever it is, right? What a horrible thing. Like I cannot approach God until I'm clean. What if our prayer life looked like that? Like, no, you don't pray to God. Don't call out to God until you're clean enough to do so. What a tragic state to find yourself in. Praise God for Christ.
No, amen. From the beginning of this book, we kind of talked about that, and I just am similar to everything that you guys are sharing. I'm overwhelmed as I read a book like this to see how hopeless our state would be if it weren't for something that could fix this problem. And so, even think of all the struggling that you would try and do on your own personal watch to try and make sure that you're remaining clean, and then to know how quickly you could be defiled by something else, how easy that could possibly be. And then all the steps that might need to be taken, many of them are well outside of your control. And this verse in 1531, the horror of dying in your uncleanness, and even this statement of defiling God's tabernacle or his dwelling place among them. The idea that we would be attempting, if we, tried to fix this on our own, or just dwelling in the presence of this holy and righteous God, that we could possibly defile his dwelling place, and that certainly he will take pains to protect that and to protect his holiness, which means the simplest, most straightforward way is for him to kill us, if that was how we were dwelling. Of course, I know we're not under this Levitical law, but if we were in this situation, and then at once again, I'm struck by the mercy and kindness of God, that although we're hearing all this, that he is still trying to provide a way, or not trying, but he is providing a way that they can dwell in his midst. And so, we see this glorious purpose of God dwelling in the midst of his people, that God has chosen these people for this purpose. Moses understood it. Of course, when God threatened to withdraw from them, and Moses said, if you're not with us, what's the point of all this anyway? Like, if your presence isn't among us, how could we possibly be distinguished from all the other peoples of earth? And yet the difficulty of this does seem to be demanding a long-term solution. This can't possibly be it. I mean, this is an untenable thing forever. And of course, we know that it's ultimately fulfilled in Christ, which should give us, instead of skipping this book, I think for any Christian who reads this, infinite reasons to praise the Lord for the atonement that he made once and for all, to be able to actually make us pure, not even just to go into the presence of God on our behalf, but even to bring us in that we could boldly approach. It's astonishing. Again, as far as the application stuff goes, no demerits are awarded for running a little bit ahead on that, because that's kind of the rule that we have established, at least for this part. All the other demerits that were handed out still stand. So that, when you ran ahead for different reasons, shame on you, shame. You should cover your lip and shout unclean for that. But you guys have any other thoughts on this book before we conclude our discussion on Leviticus 11 through 15?
A ton. How much time you got?
I mean, as much as you want, I guess.
No, I just think that like you said earlier, to skip all this and act like this is not important or doesn't mean anything, and to skip over it and think, well, I just can't understand this, I think is a big mistake. Taking the whole Bible as a whole, taking the entire Bible together, I think is obviously that's not our mission, here in this this project, but still, you can find some answers. Again, some things will elude us, but you can find answers and meaning to all this that are very important.
At the same time, amen to that, right? Read this book. At the same time, I don't want to weigh people down, young Christians down, who are trying to read this and going this just isn't my favorite book of the Bible. This is hard. Yeah, you're right. This is harder to connect to. So I want to acknowledge that. Should you wake up every morning and just jump out of bed, go, man, I can't wait to read about uncleanness in Leviticus 15? No, I don't. I wouldn't expect that. There probably are other places in your Bible that you're going to go, wow, this is comforting. This is uplifting. This is encouraging, more so than reading about, all the ways, verse 32, which we just didn't read, of Leviticus. And there are things that are just harder to tackle, and so I want to acknowledge that and not make anyone feel bad for admitting that.
Well, that's certainly true, and I'm with you. I don't think that every Christian should start their day with a healthy dose of cleanness and uncleanness. But what if you could go back in time to this moment and tell them, hey guys, the sacrifice that God is preparing, the substance that is coming, not only will allow you to be clean in the sight of God perpetually, but you could even live among the unclean nations and still be clean. That would be so revolutionary and mind-blowing for them that, if we kind of jump into the idea that, oh yeah, Jesus made it so that, God can be my forever friend, or whatever kind of, simplification that we make without really understanding this background, we might not appreciate even a small fraction of what it is that Christ has actually done to make us clean in him as we dwell in the middle of this wicked and perverse generation and all of the defilements of our own flesh and of our culture and everything else that is constantly surrounding us, that we are still able to boldly access the presence of God. In fact, not even in our midst, but in us. That is so mind-blowing and astonishing that I would want young Christians to at least understand that conceptually. I don't know how you ever get there without these books, but like I say, your point is well taken. I'm not disagreeing with you. I do not, in my own personal practice, leap out of bed every morning and say, let's get me some more, walking on paws, not for me, get you a split hoof, chew and cut. Let's get after it. That's not my personal application either. But Micah, you look like you maybe had something to say as well.
Yeah, I think that, I definitely agree with that. I don't know that this needs to be the first book a brand new Christian reads. However, it is certainly, I don't know of many books that demonstrate that Christ is the sum and substance of all of Scripture, quite like this one. This is a book in the Pentateuch. It's a book in the first 5 books of the Bible. And obviously I think that we would all say that the whole Bible is Christ-centered. This book peculiarly demonstrates that. And obviously we have the we have the privilege of looking back on that through the entirety of the New Testament, including the book of Hebrews, which makes direct reference to these laws and regulations over and over again. But the value of the work of Christ, I think, is seen in a peculiar way, which I wouldn't want to cut a new believer off from that, even though I wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this is the first thing that you got to tackle. I want them to be aware of the contents of it.
Well, I certainly know that all of us are well established on the record that there's no part of God's Word that we want to eliminate from the diet of discipleship and those things, but there is some reasonable semblance of thinking that a New Covenant Christian maybe would be better suited to start in the Gospels than in the book of Leviticus, but here we are in our Biblical Theology project in the book of Leviticus, so that's why we're discussing it, and hopefully it'll lay fertile ground for us, especially as we continue our conversation through the rest of the Bible, because we do want to take the whole Bible together. We're just taking it one section at a time so that we can actually discuss the whole Bible, which is really difficult. A lot of times people think they're doing that in their systems, but they're leaving out big chunks. And so we want to avoid that as a possibility. But friends, that is our show for today, and that is our discussion on this. As Greg mentioned and alluded to, there is an awful lot we didn't talk about. So if you want to let us know in the comment section below if there's something that you think about or thoughts that you have from these chapters, we'd love to hear that. Certainly, we did not discuss everything that could be discussed, but we tried to hit on some of the highlights. And so whether you agree with us or disagree with us, sound off in the comment section below. If you are still watching this and you enjoyed the video, got any value out of it, feel free to click that thumbs up button. It helps us out and maybe it tells YouTube that this valuable video should be distributed to other people, that they could discover the purpose and the edification in the Biblical Theology Project. But until we see you again, friends, get equipped, obey your King, and glorify your God.
I was half listening, so I was